all the miracles that Jesus did, everything had witnesses. His healings, raising people from the dead, walking on the water, calming storms, feeding the multitude, everything had witnesses.
Hey, I'm Guy Powell, and welcome to the next episode of the Backstory in the Shroud of Turin. And of course, if you haven't already done so, please go to guypowell.com and sign up for more of these episodes and podcasts. As you know, I'm the author of The Only Witness, which is a Christian historical fiction tracing a possible history of the Shroud over the last 2 millennia. Today, we're speaking again with Russ Breault, and he has some fantastic news. He's got a whole new book out. It's called Beneath the Surface, and it's a nice, easy read to really get some great stuff, really great stuff, and about the shroud, but also about Christ and the shroud is potentially the fifth gospel, and then connecting it all over to different parts of the Bible. Really, just a great read, and will help to understand more about what Christ suffered and what his death and resurrection means to us. So, Russ, welcome. So good to have you.
Before we continue, I want to briefly tell you about my new book, The Only Witness. It's a work of Christian historical fiction rooted in years of serious research into the Shroud of Turin. The story traces what may have happened to the Shroud across 2,000 years of history through war, secrecy, faith, and survival. It puts you right into the story. If you're interested in the historical mystery behind the Shroud and its possible journey over the last 2 millennia, you can learn more and order your copy at guypowell.com or on Amazon. Now let's get back to the podcast.
Thanks, guys. It's great to be with you again.
Yeah, absolutely. So, what was your impetus for writing this book? Why did you put this book together, Beneath the Surface?
Well, beneath the surface, when the context of that phrase, in the context of this book, is kind of looking beyond the stuff that we normally talk about with the shroud, because we all know that it's the most analyzed artifact in the world. It's been subjected to thousands of hours of scientific analysis, and that stuff's fascinating, and it's fun to review, But at the same time, Thomas Aquinas, the great theologian of the Catholic Church in the 13th century, he looked at science and theology as being two sides of the same coin. And we've thoroughly looked at that one side of the coin, but we rarely venture on to the other side of the coin, is because we tend to be afraid that we're going to lose our objectivity or something if I, I mean, it's like, you really can't dance around the issue all that much, because the shroud purports to be the burial shroud of Jesus, not not Caesar, Jesus. And so I mean he's the central character of civilization. Our calendar is based on his birth. And so so my the approach in Beneath the Surface is, what if the shroud is authentic? What if it really is? How does it fit with apologetics, with prophecy, with scripture, with theology? And you'll be amazed at how well it fits. And it's because there are, in fact, when you look at it from an apologetic argument, the shroud is front and center. I mean, think about this. In the gospel narrative, I like John's version. It's a little bit more complete. Mary Magdalene goes to the tomb, finds that the stone is already rolled aside from the entrance. She peeks in, sees that the body's gone, runs to find the apostles, and says, and I quote, "Someone has taken our Lord's body out of the tomb, and I don't know where they put him." So she thinks the body's stolen. So stop right there. So the empty tomb is not enough to prove a resurrection. We always talk about the empty tomb, But that was not enough for Mary to believe that Jesus had risen. Now, Peter and John run back down to the tomb. John lets everyone know he got there first. Then Peter goes. No, so John peeks inside, sees the linen cloth lying there, but he doesn't go in. He waits for Peter. Peter finally gets there. He goes straight inside that tomb, sees the linen cloth lying there. Then John goes in, and he also notices the linen cloth lying there and believes. Well, this is an enormous thing because it begs the question of, Mary thinks the body's stolen. John goes in, sees the linen cloth lying there, and believes. Well, that's a huge difference. I mean, so it begs the question of what did John and Peter see, or at least John for sure, that Mary didn't see? And obviously something specifically related to the burial shroud. And so the fact, now we have to drill down on this, is because John then, he becomes the first of the apostles to believe in the resurrection, and that belief was based on the evidence of the linen cloth lying there in the tomb. Well, that's got to be significant. I mean, God doesn't do things by a happen chance. And so you have to ask yourself, well, was it only meant for Peter and John, or was it meant for the whole world, throughout all generations? And then I always like to follow up this argument, if you will, this apologetic argument, with taking us to Acts chapter 1, verse 3, very first chapter of Acts, verse 3. After his suffering, he showed himself to be alive through many convincing proofs. Now, most of those proofs were all post-resurrection appearances of Jesus. But the first proof was the linen cloth lying there in the tomb. And so why then would we assume that the cloth was just thrown away, burned, buried, discarded? My goodness, this was the first proof causing John to believe in the resurrection, and that's it. I mean, that's the whole thing. Paul says if the resurrection is not true, then our faith is in vain. So belief in the resurrection is central to the Christian faith. That means the shroud itself is central to the Christian faith. That's kind of a big thought. And it's it is dismissed by most evangelicals and Protestants, because they all gravitate to John Calvin, who posed the argument, well, you'd think something as significant as Jesus leaving his image on his burial shroud, that would warrant a mention in the gospel somewhere. It's a reasonable objection for sure, but not when you understand the tenor of the times. What was when were the Gospels written? 20 to 30 years after the events in question. What was happening? They already killed James in 44. They tried to kill Peter, but he escaped with the help of an angel. So persecution was in high swing. No one is going to write into their gospel account of what happened, who has the shroud, or even if the shroud existed past resurrection day. So it's not unreasonable, the fact that the Gospels are silent on it. So then if we fast forward past Constantine, he, with the Edict of Toleration in 311, legalizing Christianity, we get to the 6th century, and we look at something called the Mozarabic rite of Holy Week. This is liturgy that is brought to Spain in the 6th century by a group of Arab Catholics. And how do they translate John chapter 20, verses 5 and 6? It says, Peter and John ran to the tomb and saw the recent imprints of the dead and risen man on the linens. Well, my goodness, that's not in our translation of the scripture, but that's how they chose to translate John chapter 20, verses 5 and 6. Why would they do that? Unless it was based on something that they had seen, had knowledge of, or perhaps even passed down through oral tradition. So that's an enormous piece of evidence indicating that there was knowledge of the shroud and its mysterious image in the early centuries. And so kind of directly answering John Calvin's objection. And it's I think it's clear to me, at least, of course, and you and I and some of some others, we've been studying this for a long time. So certainly the shroud is front and center for us. But it's interesting. The shroud is front and center for the whole gospel message. It all hinges on not just the empty tomb, but the vacant linen cloth. And so that's kind of an interesting apologetic argument as to and then so anything else jump out at you when you
Yeah. Oh,
took a
yeah.
read?
Yeah, quite a bit. And yes, that Mozarabic text or translation of John was kind of interesting. And then you had a couple of other ones there. But you also had this concept of the principle of three witnesses. So tell us about that.
Well, the in the book of of course you wrote the book called The Only Witness. The the in the book of Acts it says that God does not leave himself without a witness. And it's but then in Deuteronomy 19:15 it says that the truth of any matter is established by the testimony of two or three witnesses. Now, it's interesting that of all the miracles that Jesus did, everything had witnesses. His healings, raising people from the dead, walking on the water, calming storms, feeding the multitude, everything had witnesses. But the ultimate miracle, the one that established him definitively as the Son of God, the resurrection, had no eyewitnesses. And there's a reason, because there was a big stone put in front of the entrance. But it kind of seems like it contradicts God's own rules, right? And so so now you have to begin a little searching here and say, well, maybe we're not talking about human witnesses. What if there's we always talk about the empty tomb. Sure, that would be witness number one. Anyone goes to Jerusalem, they're going to go to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and see where Jesus had risen, and but that's not enough. And so the second witness must be the linen cloth lying there in the tomb, causing John to become the first of the apostles to believe in the resurrection. It's a big piece of evidence. And but then there is a third piece of evidence, and that is in John's gospel referred to as the napkin or the face cloth that was about his face, rolled up, lying in a place by itself. And so now, what is this? Well, if you look back on Good Friday, Jesus, he gives up his spirit at 3 p.m. Now he's dead. He's an absolute mess. Just stuff coming out of his nose, his mouth. He's got blood cascading from his hair and a crown of thorns. And no doubt one of the women, I would think, would have gone up to the centurion and said, may we cover his face? And he would have said, yeah, go ahead and be quick about it. And so they put a little stool up to the side of the cross, right? Step up there, pin this cloth around his face, pin it in the back. And it would have been a tradition to cover the face of the dead. And I think especially someone so brutalized as Jesus. Here he was, this beloved man who people flocked to hear him and see him, and all of a sudden to see him like this, you would want to cover that. And this cloth would have remained on his face until they got him to the tomb. Then they would have removed that cloth, rolled it up, placed it next to the body, because that would not have been allowed to stay on his face. It was just covered with pleural effusion and blood. It was just a mess. And so then they would have taken the body, laid him on the lower part of the shroud, take that upper part. Remember, it's 14 feet long, and so, but only 3.5 feet wide. So you take this long, narrow cloth and you wrap it over the man lengthwise. But that sudarium, that face cloth, would have been rolled up, placed next to the body, because it had blood on it, and anything with blood had to remain with the body. and that we believe that this is the Sudarium of Oviedo, Spain. Done a lot of research on it, trying to correlate the pattern of pleural fluid and blood stains, and you know about 120 points of congruence. So it's, yeah, I think it's pretty solid that this cloth is associated with the shroud, and so there's your three witnesses right there: the empty tomb, the linen shroud itself, and the napkin that was rolled up in a place by itself. And so I think that's kind of interesting, is because human witnesses would all be dead, but these witnesses, they all exist today. They all testify today. You can go see. Well, maybe now's not a good time to go to Israel, but the next time they have peace over there, you can go see the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. You can go to Turin the next time they have an exhibition, see the shroud, and I think they display the Sudarium every year, and it's
Mm.
so all three testify to this day. I think that's so God, I mean, he fulfills his word.
Well, when I read that, I was thinking, well, what other witnesses, could there be when I first thought about it? And one was, and nobody knows exactly what happened at the moment of resurrection. There may have been, an enormous amount of radiation, light, or other kinds of radiation. And so that may have been very high, a lot of energy. And if you were near that, then, you might have been killed just by that. It might have been, affected you or whatever. And so, maybe that's one of the reasons why there weren't any actual human witnesses to that moment of the resurrection. Whereas what you're talking about is then after the resurrection, what things could be potentially uh, thought of as witnesses. And one of the ones was, and I haven't looked back, but I do recall that the Roman guards were turned to stone. And I do recall, I think that one of those guards was named Licinius, and he then converted. And so he's potentially also not necessarily a direct human witness, a non-Jewish, non-Christian witness, which until he converted, then here he is. He's probably indifferent to the whole situation. Then all of a sudden he experiences this event that took place, and then he possibly converts. And the other one that maybe is also taking place today is the Holy Fire in the
Mm,
Holy Sepulchre Church. And that
yeah.
takes place, and well documented. That takes place, once a year around Easter time, and which is then, potentially as well, not necessarily a witness, so to speak, but a clear evidence that something happened, something took place there. And so I
Yeah.
was, trying to think of, and there might even be others that don't come to mind at the moment, but those could also be the fourth and fifth, and maybe even, the I don't know, the sixth or seventh witness.
Yeah, the Holy Fire is certainly intriguing because it's characterized by a flame that doesn't give off any heat, and it's or at least not for the first 10 or 15 minutes. And so it's like, well, what kind of fire is this? And so you look in the biblical account, you have Moses and the burning bush. You have a fire, the bush isn't burning. On Pentecost, you have the tongues of fire resting on the shoulders of everyone who was there, and they weren't rushed to the hospital. It's so there's some kind of a biblical precedent for it, and it's usually I see it as symbolic of the presence of the Holy Spirit. And but it's interesting, when you look at the science of the shroud, we know that the burns fluoresce because they're the result of heat. And but the image, even though it is oftentimes characterized, looking like a faint scorch, we know that it's not the result of heat because the image does not fluoresce. So now we're looking for something that has some of these qualities, and it's like, when is a scorch not a scorch? When it's, well, maybe holy fire is a clue, and it's I'm not saying it's an answer, but I think it's a clue, and so because
Right.
because we don't. none of us will ever know what really went on inside that tomb, except it caused the soldiers to fall as dead men, and you know, and so the yeah. So what else in
Yeah.
your review of the book?
Absolutely. Well, the other one, of course, was the sign of Jonah, and the story of Jonah, and Jonah being in the Leviathan or the whale or whatever you want to
Hmm.
call it, for 3 days, and then gets I don't know, somehow escapes, or whatever that mechanism was, and then based on that escape, of course, he goes to Nineveh, and then he converts the whole city, and he's mad because God converted, let them be converted. But in any case, you referenced the sign of Jonah as it relates to the shroud. So tell us a little bit about that.
Well, there are different opinions on this, and it is a strange piece of passage of scripture. With these Jewish leaders were come up to Jesus, and they were trying to catch him in a trap, and they said, "Show us a sign." And Jesus said, like, show us something really cool. Turn that dog into a donkey. And Jesus says, "A wicked and adulterous generation shall not receive a sign, but only that of the prophet Jonah. And just as Jonah was in the belly of the whale for 3 days and 3 nights, so must the Son of Man also be in the belly of the earth for 3 days and 3 nights." And so, what was he saying then? He's saying, listen, the only sign you're going to get is my death, burial, and resurrection. That's it. And if that's not enough, then nothing's going to be enough. And so that was his answer. And so now, and when you look at how the gospel was preached all through first century, it was the resurrection constantly, all the time. They would preach the resurrection, and it's and the and so and remember, after Pentecost, these guys were imbued with an amazing amount of power. I mean, and authority as well. And so wherever they went, there were miracles happening. They were laying on hands. People were getting set free and delivered and healed. And in my personal opinion, they didn't need the shroud. I think the shroud quickly went into hiding, because there would have been a search and destroy mission on the part of the Romans or the Jews to find it and destroy it. And so I know there's different views as to where it went, but I can tell you it didn't remain in Jerusalem for very long. And I think it was taken out of the city, ultimately hidden away inside a wall. I think probably kept in a clay pot, much like the Dead Sea Scrolls, and you just kind of folded and rolled and placed in a clay pot, and it was walled up inside a wall. Maybe Edessa, maybe Antioch. I think Edessa, and then it was forgotten about. And then kind of rediscovered in 525. Well, what 525, now we're 200 years past Constantine. It's safe to be a Christian now. And so this cloth with this mysterious image, it becomes known as the true likeness of Christ, not made by human hands. And of course, from this point on, all of your icon images of Jesus change. They change to conform to the characteristics of the true likeness: long hair, full beard, large hollow eyes, long flattened nose, stylistically looking very similar to what we see on the shroud. And so we would tend to think that the true likeness is the same thing as the shroud. And it's but now my point in saying that is that there were 300 years of persecution, leading up to the Edict of Toleration, and I'm sure there were still some rogue elements that were still persecuting Christians. And so God providentially hides the shroud in a wall, waiting for the opportune time for it to be revealed, which just happened to be the early 6th century. And I think that had it been revealed any time prior to that, it probably would have been destroyed. But the church had to get on its feet. It had to establish itself. It had to get beyond all this persecution and get to a place where there was some kind of organization. And that's when the shroud, and that's when God says, "Okay, we can reveal it now." And I think that's so. I don't think at all that the shroud was used as a vehicle of evangelization in the early centuries. I don't. I think there would have been way too much fear that it would be destroyed. I think the anointing that these apostles had, the power and authority that God gave them post Pentecost, was all anyone needed. And but as these apostles passed away, then you get to the point where perhaps it's time for the shroud to be revealed. And so, what I believe is that and you'll see this in the book, is that God has a purpose for the shroud in every epoch of time. So in the early church, when they're battling paganism, they're battling Gnosticism, here they are saying that God himself has come down and become a human being, the incarnation, Christmas. And it's so incarnation was an enormous concept, that God would become a man, he would become one of us, and that this God man would subject himself to be crucified. I mean, it's like, people, I can't compute this. I'm used to worshiping the sun god, or whatever the gods that were common to various pagan cultures. And so this then so the so with the revelation of the true likeness, began all of these icon images. You have icon painters, and so you have these icon images of Jesus. They proliferated throughout the Eastern Church, and and they were all based on the true likeness. And so the question is, well, if God has a son, what does he look like? Well, gee, I just happen to have a picture right here. And it's like, wait a minute, gods don't die. Right, exactly. And that's why God raised Jesus from the dead after 3 days, because you're right, gods don't die. And it's and so I think that the big part in the early church was the incarnation, that God would become one of us. And but then, as you know, when looking at the history, it moves to Constantinople in 944, and then stolen in 1204 by the French during the Fourth Crusade, and then goes underground for a while, and then reappears in Lorraine, France, in 1356 as property of Geoffrey de Charnay, the most valorous knight of the realm, and now this is really interesting, because now the shroud takes on a different role, is because 1356, when the shroud was revealed and displayed in that collegiate church in Lorraine, France, this was only 4 years after the Black Death had decimated half the European population. I mean, they were just now starting to wander out of their homes, wondering if they're going to be safe, or if they're going to be nailed by this plague. And so now the shroud is put on display. People come from all around to venerate and this cloth, because now, instead of, see, during the early centuries, the focus was on the face, the face image, the true likeness, the Mendelian, but now the focus becomes on this full length cloth, revealing the entire crucifixion of what Jesus endured. And it's like, so here's an embattled population. They've all lost all kinds of family members through this plague. And, the 14th century is one of the deadliest centuries on record, characterized by war, famine, plague, poverty. It was an awful time to be alive. And here's this shroud comes up and almost says, it's almost like a beacon of hope that God is with us in our suffering. Jesus suffered with us. He understands our suffering. But in this, there's also great hope for an eternal future. And so I think the message of the shroud transitions from the incarnation to the crucifixion. And and you can tell that by all the sacred art that permeated the 14th century. It's all crucifixion based. And but then we moved into the modern era. We moved to 1898 when it's photographed for the very first time, and that mysterious photonegative image is revealed. So for some reason, the shroud looks much clearer, much more lifelike in a photonegative, meaning that the image that's on the cloth itself must be a negative image to start with. Well, this launches the shroud into the realm of scientific inquiry. And it's something that really no other relic has ever done. I mean, what's intriguing to me is that the first people that tackle the shroud are your medical experts, because they want to answer the question of, they create life-size replicas based on the photography, and and they answer the question of, could this be the image of a real human being who died from these wounds? That's what they want to know. Is it possible? And the definitive verdict from all of the medical experts that have studied it is, yeah. I mean, from Barbet to Zugabe to Buckland. I mean, Buckland, he did 25,000 autopsies. The guy knows what a dead man looks like, and so this appears to be the image of a real human being who died from these wounds. And now so I'm going to juggle two things here, is because you see, I think that the shroud is a gospel. It is a gospel unto itself. It's the first gospel, causing John to believe, right? I think it's a gospel written on linen, speaks every language, doesn't need to be translated. It speaks to every level. 5-year-old can look at it and say, look, mommy, look, daddy, there's Jesus. A teenager can get all involved in the science of it. But then the academic, the intellectual can take it as deep as you want to go. So it's an intriguing thing when you look at it as a first gospel, as a gospel written on linen. Pope John Paul II, he even calls it a mirror of the gospel. And it's but when you look at and I'm going to get back to my original thought here, hopefully,
Have at it.
is that when you look at what a gospel is, it's a strange word, my gospel, the gospel. People wonder, is it the Bible? Is it the New Testament? Is it the 4 gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? Well, actually, the gospel is pretty well defined in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 1 through 8. Where Paul talks about, if anyone should depart from the gospel that I have, my gospel, as he says, it's which is what he received from the Lord. And so what is the gospel? That Jesus suffered, that he died, and he was buried, and he rose again from the dead, and he was witnessed to by all these different people that he mentions who witnessed him after his resurrection, including himself finally, on his road to Damascus in a blinding flash of light. And so what is the gospel? It's a testimony to the suffering, death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, and that he was witnessed to after his resurrection. So what does the shroud do? So when we look at how the shroud got into the modern era, first tackled by the medical experts, right? Could this be the image of a man who died from these wounds? Yes, and the man is dead. with evidence of rigor mortis, with evidence of the side wound, with a clear separation of blood and blood serum that only occurs when the heart is no longer beating and the blood is no longer circulating. So the man is clearly dead. But then you have this inexplicable image that on the shroud we have an image of a man in death through the bloodstains. We have an image of a man coming back to resurrection life through this incredible image we see. But as well, it's superficial. I won't go into all that, but it's this incredible image that's has been determined as not the work of an
Yeah.
artist. It's not painted on there, and it's and this. But then also, part of the gospel is the fact that that Jesus is witnessed to after his resurrection. He has all these post-resurrection appearances. Well, this is exactly what happens with the shroud, is that we too, 2,000 years later, can see the fact that this cloth testifies to the life, suffering, death, and resurrection of Jesus, and we are witnesses to it. It basically he's making an appearance to us today through the shroud, and it's so I think that the shroud is a gospel unto itself, and it's and so I think I think that's just a really I think that's a big thought, and it's
Mm.
the because the other thing I talk about is where John Paul he talks about how the shroud is a mirror of the gospel, which is a really beautiful characterization. I really like that a lot. But the interesting thing about a mirror is that a mirror can also magnify. And so your big telescopes are all just mirrors, and it's and so I think the reason the shroud exists as a first gospel is because when you read the gospel account of what happened to Jesus, it's very understated. Then Pilate had Jesus scourged. That's it. I mean, but on the, how about a little more detail, But no, I mean, but on the shroud, we see all the detail. We see the massive scourging all over the body, and then Pilate had Jesus crucified. That's it. But it's like, but on the shroud, we see the nail wounds in the wrist. We see the blood on the arms. We see the thumbs drawn in. We see we see the nail wounds in the feet. And then they platted a crown of thorns, and they put and around his head and mocked him, King of the Jews. It's like, but when you look at the shroud, you see over 30 puncture wounds all around the head from where this massive clump of thorns probably beat into his head with sticks. And it's so we see the where the scripture is kind of understated, it's revealed through the shroud. And I think purposely so, is because God didn't want to waste all this time describing, if you will, the horrific goings on of a terrible public execution. And it's I think that's now there's my favorite one too, the classic understatement. Well, I think this is in Romans. He says,
Yeah, I think it was in Romans. Yep.
it says, while we were yet sinners, Christ
Yeah.
died for us. And I'm saying, that's a little weak. I mean, it's Christ died for us. You see, the interesting thing is, if all Jesus needed to do was to die for us, well, why not just get stuck through with a sword or have your head cut off like John the Baptist? Why did Jesus have to go through this enormous?
Yeah, let me stop you right there, and we'll talk about that because I thought that was just a wonderful thought as well. But one of the things that you mentioned was how the shroud represents kind of the life, death, and resurrection. Well, the life to me is that, when you think about God sent his son in the form of a man, and the image on the shroud is in the form of a man. It's not in the form of some alien weird creature that you'd see on
Right,
Star Trek, right? It's in
right.
the form of a man. It's got, the image there has a beard, it has a nose, has eyes, has a chin, has everything, and it's perfectly anatomically correct. It's not like, it was drawn by somebody where the legs were too long or the feet were too short or something like that. And so then to your point that not only does it show the death and resurrection, but it shows that God sent his only begotten son as a man, number one. And then of course, like you said, that you can see the suffering that he went through and what Pontius Pilate did. So anyway, yes, it's definitely Paul, Romans 5:8. I have that written down here as one of my thoughts. While we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. And then as you talk about it, and I'll let you go on now, how the shroud fills in the blanks, so to speak, with what is actually behind that wonderful verse from Paul.
Yeah, because I mean, it's like, I mean, it's a great verse, but it's like it's leaving a lot on the table. It's like when while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. So the question is, if all Jesus had to do was die, I mean, like I said, I mean, he could have arranged with the Father to say, at a certain time, they're gonna ram me through a sword, and then I'll be dead. But that's not how it happened. So God the Father and God the Son were in agreement with what had to happen. And I mean, this was not a surprise for Jesus that he was going to be crucified. It was prophesied in Isaiah 700 years prior. So it begs the question of why would why would God the Father and God the Son, why would Jesus allow himself to be subjected to the most horrific form of execution ever devised by man? That's not just a form of execution, but a method of torture and just total humiliation. And ultimately, you die by your life just gradually ebbing away until you finally succumb to death. 6, 7, 8 hours after initially being nailed to the cross. In the case of Jesus, it was 6 hours, and it's so I mean, so it begs the question: why? Why was all that necessary? Well, it has to do with the first part of that verse. While we were yet sinners, open that up. Oh, you don't want to look in that box because there's some ugly stuff in that box called sinners. The worst of the worst, of the most vile of the vile. I mean, you just can't even talk about it. And but you see, this is so incredible. Is that when you think that sin needed to be atoned for, it needed to be paid for. That's what Jesus came to do. He came to basically pay, to atone for the sins of man. And so, which is a beautiful thought, because that means that some inner city gangbanger who's been involved in gang and mob activity and murders and in burglaries and rapes, and all of a sudden, somebody preaches the gospel at him, and he gets drawn to the message of love and forgiveness, but then he's stopped in his tracks by his own thoughts that say, how can God forgive me? Because I've done this and I've done this and I've done this. And the answer is, it's paid for. It's paid for. That's what the cross is all about. That's why the crucifixion had to be as extreme as it was, to literally atone for the worst of human depravity. And and so this is a beautiful understanding. And and when you think of how that manifests as love. So for instance, there's a little chapter in the book called that God is the God of extremes. And we launched the Hubble telescope, and put it out in orbit, and some scientists thought we'd find the edge of the universe, never found it. So we put out the James Webb telescope, put that 1 million miles out in orbit, and and now and now we're finding galaxies that shouldn't exist, messing with our cosmology. We're having to rewrite the Big Bang theory, and it just goes to show that God is bigger than we could ever imagine. And and but then also, let's go in the opposite direction. Let's go into our human genetics, into the in 1953 we discovered the double helix DNA molecule. In 2003 we mapped the entire human genome, and or at least we think we did. We didn't. We got most of it, but there's still millions and millions of base pairs that we're discovering right now that have genetic function. And so when we realize that our DNA, every cell of our body has DNA, and it's packed with 3.3 billion lines of genetic code. It's almost like God leaves his calling card, leaves his business card, and on the back it says, "Still not sure." I mean, it's like for all the materialists in the world that want to believe that this evolved from a random process. So and so when we look at the God of extremes, and then of course, we have examples from the Bible, which I use. The feeding of the multitude. It's getting late in the day. You got 10,000, 5,000 men, and a bunch of women and children on the hill. Jesus, I think we should send them home. They're going to start to get hungry. You feed them. What do you mean we feed them? We only have a boy's lunch. That's it. And so he has everyone sit down, and the story. He passes the loaf and the fish, and they keep going and going and going until there are 12 baskets left over. I mean, and then on the third post-resurrection appearance of Jesus, they're Peter, James, and John. They're all disillusioned. I mean, Jesus is dead. It's probably Saturday in between, when he was killed and versus when he was risen. And so they don't know what to do. The only thing they know how to do is do what they always do, is go fishing. And so they went out fishing all night, catch nothing. They come to the shore. There's this man on the beach that says, "Throw out your net for a catch." They're saying, "What is he? What do you think we've been doing all night?" Nevertheless, we'll do it. And so they threw the net out. Of course, you know the story. The ship or the boat almost sank from so many fish, and so they knew who the man was immediately. So these are examples, but you see, where this comes back to the shroud is that you can look at these examples of the Hubble and the James Webb telescope. You can look at examples of what we're finding out in the genetic code, and come to believe that there must be a creator, that this stuff can't have happened through a random process. But you see, that alone doesn't mean that Jesus sent his son, and that God sent his son into the world to die on a cross and rise again from the dead. That's where the shroud comes in. The shroud testifies to this central truth of Christianity that isn't necessarily discerned simply because of creation. Creation gets you to the belief in God, but it doesn't get you to the belief that the Son of God came and had to die. And that's why we have the shroud, which testifies to that central event of Christianity.
Yeah, how true. Well, actually, and I've been chastised for that. Is it's not the central event for Christianity. It's the central event for all mankind,
Oh,
whether
yeah.
you're Christian or
Yeah.
not. And we've covered basically, just about all the questions that I have, and we're just about out of time. But one last thing, and you kind of hinted at it and spoke about it. But what do you want readers to come away with after they get done with the book? What is the kind of the one central thing that you want them to come away with?
To understand, let me add, to when we look at the God of extremes, we see creation, we see genetics, we see all this. How would you characterize extreme love? How do you demonstrate that? Jesus said, greater love has no man than he lay his life down for his friends. And so true love is sacrificial. And that's what Jesus did. He offered his life as a complete sacrifice. And so how would you describe the extreme love? That's the cross. That's the cross. The fact that he was willing to go through it. And he didn't resist it. He didn't curse his accusers. He just went through it quietly and just suffering and just, you know, I mean, you and I would be cursing our brains out with the with the first whip, you know, But it's the and so that's what the cross is, and that's what the shroud reveals. The shroud reveals this extreme love. Now, the one thing I would want for people to come away with that, to understand how much we say it all the time. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son. We say it, but do we really comprehend it? And I think the shroud helps us comprehend
Hmm.
just what it means when it says that God loves us. And it's because remember, God is a God of extremes. He doesn't do things halfway. And it's but the other thing as we get to the end of the book is a little understanding of who Jesus is. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding out there as to who Jesus is. And when we understand that he is the co-creator of the universe, that this co-creator, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and there was nothing made that wasn't made through the Word. And then a few verses down, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory, the glory of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. So we understand that this co-creator of the universe, who was there at the very beginning of the foundation of all creation, is the very one who went to the cross for us. It's so incredible. It's so incomprehensible. And the shroud is here to validate it, to give people hope and reassurance that these things are true. And that's what the shroud's all about.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. What a powerful way to say that. So, Russ, thank you so much. And again, we're talking about his new book. It's called Beneath the Surface. And so, where can folks find this book and purchase this book and find out more about you and about some of the things you're doing related to the shroud, and of course your teachings and everything else that you're doing?
Well, you can go to Amazon and you'll find I have about 4 books up there, and this is my most recent one. And then the last one I did was called "Understanding the Shroud." It's a very short book, overview of everything. And then the first one I came out with in 24 is called Shroud Encounter: Explore the World's Greatest Unsolved Mystery. They're all up on Amazon. You can also go to my website, shroudencounter.com. They're all there, and it's and so yeah, so and I have some socials. You can, I brand everything Shroud Encounter. So if you look on Facebook, on Instagram, on YouTube for Shroud Encounter, you'll find my stuff. So yeah, thank you.
Fantastic. Yeah, Russ, thank you for being here today. And that's shroudencounters.com, shroudencounters.com. And Russ, what a message and what a story. And so good that you're putting out these books and looking forward to the next one and the next one after that and the next one after that. So fantastic. So for the audience, of course, definitely stay tuned for many more episodes in this series on the backstory of the Shroud of Turin. Russ, thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure, Guy. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely.